Nosology is the study of the history of diagnoses.
No, it's actually about noses.
Diagnoses.
It's about the naming of disorders. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Nosological stuff is
They're putting their nose into disorders.
Hysteria versus somatoform. Right.
All right.
It's too bad because otherwise we could have named Fleece as the father of nosology.
What a miss. I know. What a shame.
Feels a little overdetermined as both they themselves kind of
on the nose.
Jesus Christ.
That's like 5 puns in the first 30 seconds. Should we restart?
No, I gotta say, one thing I loved about the most recent Stabby was the way you were dropping the Who bar.
The Who? What? The what?
The CSI.
Oh,
yeah. They would do this thing where every single one of them made a pun. Yeah. They would do the sound of, is it Ant Whistle or whoever from the Who?
Yeah.
Doing the
the CSI Miami intro sound effect. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, I'm glad you like that. Thanks, buddy.
No, sorry. That brought a lot of delight to me. But
it tickled your nose. I don't know. That doesn't even make sense.
It was one of those things that was very funny the first 5 times, not funny the next 5 times, infuriating 10 more times, and then the remaining 30 or 40 times you did it, I was
just loops back around.
Yeah, losing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, noses.
Noses.
Have you ever stolen a child's nose?
Oh yeah. 100%. That's a fun game.
No.
Abby's looking at me terrified. I don't mean collect their noses and make a necklace out of them or something. I mean
some Cruella de Vil kind of situation. No, I actually don't. I'm sorry. I don't spend a lot of time around children.
Stealing noses. Yes, I've done that many times. It's a great party trick. And my favorite thing is 1, they're usually delighted, but 2, my favorite thing is the 1 out of 10 that are the existential dread moment. I kind of love that. Is that cruel of me? I kind of love that when they're oh my God, he actually has my nose in his hand.
What are you actually talking about?
So you have a child, presumably this is a smaller child.
By legal means. Yeah.
This is a fun uncle thing.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about?
It's a funkle thing. Yeah. No, it's one you got a kid and they've got a squishy nose or whatever. And maybe they're because some babies' noses they're less cartilaginous or they feel less you can look, the texture of the nose doesn't really matter here. The point is the baby.
I don't know, it's what you're leading with.
The baby is either not, or the child is not dexterous enough to be able to reach the front of its own face, or it's immobilized in a high chair or a stroller or something. And you're oh, I'm going to steal your nose. I'm going to steal your nose. And then you reach in with 2 fingers, right? And you 2 knuckles and you grab its nose. Or maybe if you're clever about it, you sort of grab the nose and then kind of 3-card Monty style sort of palm it. So it appears that you've actually grab the nose from their face, and then you eat it.
Dan doing this makes him look like he's in an 80s hairband.
Well, imagine you were a child and Dan, with his flowing locks,
my terrifying demeanor,
beard. No, he's not terrifying, but you've just stolen a child's nose, right? And,
yeah.
And so
blood everywhere.
But it's yours somehow. Andrew WK
so
style, yeah. But Dan, can we go back? So the 2 reactions that kids have.
Yeah.
What are they again?
The first one's delight, giggling, chuckling, because they're looking at your hand and it's sleight of hand. It's a fun magic trick, and they're happy that you're engaging with them and they're not really taking it seriously. The other one is existential dread, castration anxiety. Oh my God, he's sawing the front of my face off.
Yeah,
and they immediately start screaming and crying, and then I feel bad.
They start asking for it back. I mean, if you're being nice, and hopefully it takes you then you put the nose back, but you squish their nose a little bit, and they're oh yeah, my nose is there. But I was thinking about this. Here's the trademark. 2 reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The first of which was because the kid in question, part of why it works, right? Or why it works in a particular age range.
Yeah.
Is that the kid doesn't necessarily have all the proprioception stuff. And in any ways, you don't really feel your nose anyways, because of that co-anesthetic property of you don't really feel organs unless they're being simulated. Right. So the kid may actually think that you've taken its nose in this way, which speaks to how the child is, well, you want to be Lacanian about it. It hasn't had that mirror stage moment of imaginary cohesion, if you want to say that, but also, and this is the more Winnicottian stuff, it hasn't really cohered into a subject with rigid boundaries, or at least it's afraid that
it's still baking. It's not cookies.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's afraid that someone's going to pull off part of its gingerbread appendage. Right. And that is legitimately distressing for the child, right? By the same token, and we're still on aspect number 1 here, right?
for those keeping track.
Part
at
2 of
home.
1.
I want to do this like scholastic, like Thomas Aquinas style.
You
1,
should see
1A.
this man's outlines, honestly. Go on.
But as the child gets older, it starts to kind of enjoy it as play. So the second aspect of like what makes this interesting from the child's perspective, right, or from like the Winnicottian account of the child's perspective, is that at a certain point, the kid understands, no, you can't actually take noses, right? And I've been thinking about kids who be like, no, you can't take my nose, right? No, there are no noses, right? But then you make those noises back to them and like, yes, I can, right?
Yep.
And in other words, it becomes play. So what previously was like this kind of terrifying, like fear of aggression, of loss, etc., now actually becomes this place for like symbolization. No, my nose can't be taken away. Noses are not exchangeable. Right?
Yeah.
For goods and or services.
The second thing that this made me think about, though, in relation to what we've been reading for the past, couple of episodes, is the perspective from the adults, sort of like end of the experience. And on the one hand, like maybe we as adults are afraid that our noses could get taken away, like literally, perhaps when we dream, perhaps as a castration anxiety thing. Maybe you're Nikolai Gogol and you write that wonderful story, The Nose. Have you guys read The Nose?
No.
It's a story about a guy. Well, it actually is a story about a bunch of people, but it's about a guy whose nose like runs away from him and then proceeds to sort of take over his life. Like he's in the military and now he sees the nose walking around in the uniform and dating women and like otherwise. It's a whole bunch of things. And then, but the point is like, even if part of what's at stake when we steal the child's nose is as adults, assuaging our own fear of the loss of our nose. The real reason we do it, or the real reason some of us do it, is because it's fun as hell. And as Dan kind of neatly expressed it, well, what's part of the fun?
Tormenting a child.
Yeah, you make the kid kind of squirm.
Showing
right?
a little bit of hate, maybe.
In the Winnicottian sense, yeah. It's like it's right up there with like, oh, I'm gonna eat you up. And maybe it's just that the baby is small enough, you literally bite its nose or something. Not like literally bite, but like you gum it.
You act it out. Yeah.
And of course, we can't, one shouldn't dismember one's child, right? We've kind of agreed that that's taboo.
That's what the liberals say.
Jesus Christ. You cannot you cannot take your child's nose. We get to enact an aggressive pleasure at the child.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
But the point is, we do it because
it's an expression of hate. Is that where you're going?
Well, it's an expression of aggression towards the child.
Yeah.
It's a displaced aggression of like, well, now I'm going to make you squirm about something. Like you've been crying about like, where's this and where's that and why aren't we there yet and where's the toy and make the little thing squirm.
Yeah.
But it's also on the adult's end a type of playful regression.
Yeah, it's joy and aggression all mingled together, which is where we have been. Which is the sort of sandbox as it were that we've been playing in for the last few episodes.
Welcome back. It's episode 3 of Winnicott's toddler trolling.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
I'm Dan Yowell.
And today we are embarking on part 3 of what is shaping up to be a 4-part series on hate and aggression, which is continuing to center on this essay of Winnicott's, first delivered in 1947, published in 1949, Hate in the Counter-Transference. Last time we made it through the first few pages of the essay, in particular looking at the relationship between analyst and analysand. And today where we're picking up is midway through with Winnicott's healing dreams, and we're going to turn to looking at how this is not only a theory of hate in the counter-transference in the analytic situation, but also how it relates to the mother-child dyad. Patrick, because the last episode was behind the paywall, do you want to do a real quick and dirty recap of a little bit of what we surveyed last time?
Totally. So, as we've established in previous episodes, this thinker, D.W. Winnicott, a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst, has, among other things, a vision of aggression, which he takes to be a generative, sort of fundamental human impulse that one way or another needs to find expression in our lives. That ramifies developmentally. And in fact, much of his account of aggression is that part of how a child sort of comes into its self-consciousness is through expressing aggression in different ways. And that over time, the ways in which its environment, i.e. its caregivers, respond to that aggression is foundational for that child's developing a sort of stable sense of self and ability to apologize for things, to take accountability, to, otherwise navigate relationships. This is a theory of developmental individuation in which aggression must be recognized and channeled. And it's also a theory of how developmental arrests in that environment, sort of failures or displacements of aggression, can find pathological expression in adults. At the same time, it's a generalized theory of the idea that proposes that normal, quote unquote, high-functioning adults also have aggression in all sorts of ways.
Right, because it's essential. This is something that we covered in the first episode, but I think it's important, at the risk of beating a dead horse, to say that aggression is part of sorting out the distinction between self and other. And last time we moved away from aggression and turned to hate.
Yeah, and hate is sort of the name that we as adults give to a particular kind of like expression of aggression as an affect, that like this is this feeling of distress inside me, but it expresses itself by being extended towards an object which I feel negative affects towards, right? That covers most of what that covers what we did in the first episode and a bulk of the last episode. But what we spent most of the time last episode talking about, and if you want to hear this, please throw us $5 and become a subscriber. We can't do this without your support.
$5. It's a coffee. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
You could be aggressive towards us in giving it to us, but we'd still like it. Winnicott, for reasons that are kind of remarkable in terms of his biography and his historical context, has an acute dislike for the contemporary psychiatric establishment in Britain. And his claim is that patients who provoke particular types of distress in mental health caregivers may become the objects of like disavowed or displaced hate on the part of clinicians who, among other things, will send them in for barbaric psychosurgeries like lobotomies, which Winnicott has no constraints about calling hateful and contemptible and barbaric. So again, the idea here is there is going to be aggression. There are going to be feelings of hate. The question is, what do we do about those things? And do we disavow them, or do we enact them? Do we displace them, or do we work with them in some other way?
Right. And a lot of, and I'm going to dive right in a second, but I will say one other important thing that we talked about extensively last time was about the difficulty of managing the hate on the part of the analyst. At which point I'm going to segue right into where we left off here. And I'm now quoting Winnicott, and I want you to hear that I'm moving from, although he's still talking about the relation of the analyst to the patient, this is the pivot point of the paper where we move from the analyst needing to be able to feel this objective hate for the patient and yet also conceal that hate at this point from the patient. We move from that to the mother as the figure of hate par excellence. So Winnicott says, quote, "The analyst must be prepared to bear strain without expecting the patient to know anything about what he is doing. perhaps over a long period of time. To do this, he must be easily aware of his own fear and hate. I'm not closing the quote. I'm just saying a sidebar here. That is mostly what we talked about last time. This is not new. What is new is what follows. He is in the position of the mother of an infant unborn or newly born. Eventually, he ought to be able to tell his patient what he has been through on the patient's behalf. But an analysis may never get as far as this. There may be too little good experience in the patient's past to work on. What if there be no satisfactory relationship of early infancy for the analyst to exploit in the transference? There is a vast difference between those patients who have had satisfactory early experiences, which can be discovered in the transference, and those whose very early experiences have been so deficient or distorted that the analyst has to be the first in the patient's life to supply early environmental essentials. In the treatment of the patients of the latter kind, all sorts of things in analytic technique become vitally important that can be taken for granted in the treatment of patients of the former type. Close quote. And I said we're headed towards the figure of the mother. We're going to get there. We're going to get there in like a dedicated way and talk about this feeling of hate and the many ways that Winnicott enumerates the forms in which that hate manifests. But here, the pivot isn't quite to the mother yet, but to what it is that the mother, and hear the mother here as earliest caregiver. Okay, you don't have to hear it as the literal mother. What it is for some patients that the mother has supplied, and what for some other patients, the patients that Winnicott is really interested in working with here, the ones that he's calling psychotic, but that for he's really mostly talking about patients that we would probably think of as in experiencing unstable self states, or what we might call borderline. What is this experience that some have had and that some have not, that needs, in the latter case, to be not just supplemented, but supplied by the analyst?
Another way we might be able to say this is that there's, in these cases that he's talking about, a really kind of profound, not just like analogy or like mirroring, but a direct kind of like almost organic continuity between what's at stake in the infantile environment of development and what's at stake and happening in the encounter with a clinician.
Yes, exactly.
That aspect of the environmental is really key, I think. In the sense that...
Yeah. Can you say more about that? Because that's actually where we ended last time, where you were talking about Winnicott as like a theorist of the environment.
Yeah, and I mean environment not in like ecology kind of sense, but almost in like a phenomenological sense.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Right, in the sense of like, how is the world revealed to us through perception?
Yeah, and in relation.
Yeah, in relation, and particularly over the course of time as we develop, right? I mean, think about like this in the sense of like, well, hell, those babies, they don't know that they have noses that can't be stolen, right? Or that actually stealing a nose would be much more painful than, just being squeezed, right? There is a way in which like, and this, it's a difficult thing to talk about philosophically for clinicians, for anybody, I think, right? But we're talking about the child or the infant as like an emerging subject, but not as something that has consistent subject-object dualism, that can necessarily narrate all its experiences across time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a Cartesian cogito, right?
Well, I mean, I think, I think it's helpful at this moment to talk about this idea that I think we probably mentioned in the first installment of this series, that for Winnicott, there's no such thing as a baby. Right. Okay. And I don't mean that in some sort of like, ceci n'est pas un peep kind of way. It's not a trick. It's the idea that there is no baby. You have to think about the baby in the baby mother dyad. There is only this dyadic relationship. And so here, Winnicott is talking about another dyadic relationship. He's talking about the analyst-patient relationship. And there is a kind of reparative work that has to be done here for patients who did not have what it is that for Winnicott, the good enough mother can supply, which, as we're going to see, is not just this sort of constant attunement to them, but is actually the mother's hate and thus the baby's ability to survive that hate and to understand itself as worthy of love. And I think it's helpful here to see how literal this supplementing or supplying. I'm still kind of playing with those two things. And I think supplying is the right, because it's what we're talking about is the attempt to remedy a deficit that perhaps can never be entirely remedied. But Winnicott, as we'll see, is going to give it the old college try. And he's going to understand this in a really literal way. Because as Patrick pointed out earlier today, and as we saw in our original reading of Roots of Aggression, symbolizing is really, really important for Winnicott in the development of a coherent self. And the patients that he's talking about dealing with here, that he has to offer up his hate to while also concealing it from them. They are in some way frozen in a pre-symbolic stage. And so this supplying of hate and love, which are going to be inextricably linked here, is going to manifest itself to this patient in more literal than symbolic ways. And so let me pick up a little bit after where I was just reading. I asked an analyst who confines his attention to neurotics whether he does analysis in the dark, and he said, "Why no? Surely our job is to provide an ordinary environment, and the dark would be extraordinary." He was surprised at my question. He was orientated toward analysis of neurotics, but this provision and maintenance of an ordinary environment can be in itself a vitally important thing in the analysis of a psychotic. In fact, it can be at times even more important than the verbal interpretations, which also have to be given. For the neurotic, the couch and warmth and comfort can be symbolical of the mother's love. For the psychotic, it would be more true to say that these things are the analyst's physical expression of love. The couch is the analyst's lap or womb, and the warmth is the live warmth of the analyst's body, and so on. Close quote.
And again, you can tell that it's difficult for Winnicott to talk about, even to his colleagues, right? But what he's trying to conjure here are people who, because of things that have happened to them or that didn't happen to them in an infantile mode, are coming to him not just with sort of things that need to be remediated, right? But also those things that need to be remediated can be kind of traps, right? Or pitfalls for the therapeutic encounter. And it's difficult for Winnicott to put into words what that means. I'm going to take a stab at this that might be a little helpful.
Yeah, please.
Right? Unfortunately, I understand everything I'm going to say here is sort of metaphorical because I'm going to use examples from like later in developmental life, right? Because the actual question of what like the disruption in the environment we're talking about here, right? Winnicott here is, we can imagine a variety of things, that might go wrong in the mother-infant dyad, right? Mom is sick, mom is being beaten by dad, and numerous things can happen. So we can even structuralize the figure of the mother to a certain extent and make her into like a function, if you will. But the key thing that I kind of want to stress here is that for the patients that Winnicott is talking about, their sense of cohesive self, to the extent to which they have that, is more fragile than the typical neurotics. And that intense affects or experiences, particularly aggression, are already a kind of risk for them. Right? Clearly they can symbolize, clearly maybe they may be floored in certain other ways, et cetera, right? They are adults after all. But that in this environment of analysis and in the transference, certain sort of psychic wounds are reopened in the way that, a psychic trauma doesn't naturally scab over. And those can press on or activate that basic fear of like a lack of self-integrity or of being overwhelmed by emotions of destruction and negativity that are coming from within or without. Right. So here's some examples. I'm just going to try and off the top of my head. Right.
Please.
And we have to try and, again, back project these, but to get the sense of like this almost like ontological, like being level vulnerability. But right.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to put it.
Yeah, it's a properly existential dread.
It's the texture of one's being.
Yeah, it's kind of like the vision of the kid squirming as you take their nose, like, but an actual terror is not entirely wrong, right? Except it also has some additional elements of like super added vulnerability too, in the sense of like, so imagine like, I don't know, if kids when they have tantrums will say all sorts of nasty things, right? Like imagine the kid that's like, I don't know, you're getting your toddler dressed and she says, "Mommy, I hate you and I want you to die," right? Kids say these things. Imagine one thing an adult is not supposed to say is, "I fucking hate you too. I'm eager to help you meet God sooner rather than later, you little shit." You can't say that, right? Clearly adults do, right? But you can't like.
But you oughtn't to.
You oughtn't.
This is not one of the occasions where mirroring back to the child is what is called for.
Exactly. Like if you're slightly more
you
emo,
weather the assault.
If you're 8-year-old,
you weather the assault.
If they say like, "I wish I'd never been born," you don't say, "Yeah, well, you were a fucking mistake and I wanted to abort you, but Dad said I couldn't."
Yeah.
Right. Again, these are grotesque things to say, but I want to make 2 points. One, people actually do say these types of things to their kids, and two, imagine something like that happening, like that sort of like the child is in distress, the child is feeling negativity, and then rather than being like ratified or contained, this powerful figure on whom the child is dependent like lashes back with an even more overwhelming, threatening anger that both affirms the bad feelings that the child is having, but also is like, "And you deserve it. And this is your fault. And this is all on you." Right? So again, those are grotesque examples of things people do say. Like, we shouldn't, right?
They do.
But now, what Winnicott's trying to get at is imagine in a much more early moment, and those are also examples of parents doing and using language in ways that are terrible and, horrible, right? And consciously so, right? Let's try and imagine similarly invalidating, distressing, almost like desubjectivizing or like anti-subjectivizing, like working against your developing sense. Yeah.
Anti, not D.
Yeah, because you haven't gotten there yet. Yeah. On the level of like the infant caregiver relationship, right? It's like, you're falling asleep in mom's arms and then suddenly you get dropped, right? Or maybe you can't go to sleep there anymore, right?
Or maybe you can't go to sleep at all.
Exactly. So the idea here then, and that's what Winnicott's talking about with like the couch here, right?
Yeah.
And so the point is not that these people are like literally infants, nor still that like we can pinpoint the specific thing that may have happened to the patient in the past, or that
right.
like, like
and that's not what Winnicott's even looking for, right?
Yeah, in fact, he's going to go in the opposite direction of any type of mother blaming. But like,
yeah.
It's not like being like, well, this is the time you were cyclically dropped on your head, because part of like the twist or the horror of this is that some of these like environmental failures can just happen, right? They just do through even the best intentions.
Right. They don't necessarily involve malice.
Maybe mom has been traumatized, right? Or maybe mom dies, right? There are all sorts of things that can.
Yeah.
But that whatever the case is, it's not just like the patient needs like remedial attention the way you might, I don't know, the way I might need a refresher in algebra, or I have nightmares about that, right? It's not like a splint on a thing that was going to heal, that's now going to heal normally.
Or like a branch, like a tiny branch of an already like intact tree.
Exactly.
We're talking about like the actual roots.
Yeah, exactly. You have to work with the fully present sort of downstream adult that survived, kind of remarkably, but also survived with damage on the level of its personhood, such experiences that kind of work against developing a sense of personhood.
A sense of intact personhood.
Yes.
I used that word before, but I think it is a helpful one to think about this idea of experiencing oneself as intact.
And safe,
And
maybe another way, yeah.
One safe and continuous.
Yes.
Right. As opposed to, and we're not, as much as I do like to talk about, experiences of fragmentation of the self as just ontologically the case. We're not going in that sort of direction here. We're not saying there isn't change over time. We're talking about the ability to perceive continuity and, as Patrick said, safety in that continuity over time, despite the onrushing of change, which is just, well, basically that's what life is.
And it's really hard to talk about. It's hard to talk about morally, imaginatively, but it also pushes against our the ways in which the subject is a thing that we occupy over time and use language to narrate, right?
Yeah, that that is in most sentences that most of us utter.
It coordinates everything, and yet Winnicott seems to say there are people who use language who show up for therapy, but they're held together against something because of something.
Yeah.
Right. And there's this centrifugal energy, right? The aggression of the other and their own ability to contain and survive their own aggression has been somehow compromised. And I don't think it's insignificant that it's difficult even for someone like Donald Winnicott, who works with people and kids to talk about, right?
Who works specifically with really distressed kids and adults.
Yeah, to conjure the inner experience and terrors of somebody whose capacity for metabolizing experience has been shaped in a radically different way because of environmental terrors that they still carry with them is a difficult exercise. And it's probably not a coincidence either that the closest he comes to kind of grasping what that might be like, in contradistinction to more neurotic or stably organized types, is through dreams, is through a pair of dreams that he has.
I will not do more than briefly refer to the field of the infant-mother relationship, the child-parent relationship, because I have already written my share of the psychoanalytic contribution to this subject. I will remind you, however, that psychoanalysts tend to show that the basis of mental health is not only hereditary, and is not only a matter of chance events. The basis of mental health is being actively laid down in the course of every infancy when the mother is good enough at her job, and in every childhood that is lived in the intact family.
Can I ask to try to put this in actually, I'm going to say right now, I'm actually kind of a fan of covering what we covered and going back to the dreams, because I think the dreams are a little abrasive. Yeah.
That's exactly what I wanted.
Can I try to put this in a different set of words to make sure that I understand the concepts you're putting out there? And then I think that might help to contextualize this dream that he has.
Please.
Yeah.
For an infant child, for an infant baby, we're talking extremely young, so young that they haven't even constituted what I am yet. They are just stimulus and dealing with stimulus. And Winnicott later in this paper is going to go on to maybe posit that could hate have something to do with the development of what I am. He's going to say it's that fundamental later, and I'm excited to get there. So he's saying before that point, the baby is experiencing affectionate things, warmth, security, safety, stuff that we would bucket under love. And the baby's also experiencing frailty, danger, lack, hunger, things that aren't quite so pleasant, things that he, the child reacting to those things, he describes that as having aggression. And then the experience, the affect of that aggression, we would call hate. So he's saying if somebody in childhood has those kinds of most basic formulative experiences undercut or undermined or interrupted, that this later in life can cause symptoms that you cannot treat the adult symptoms through the adult. You have to try to pre-situate. Nah, man, I'm doing a bad job.
No, you're not. In fact, the way that you're struggling with this, I think,
it is
the heart of the
Winnicott's
problem.
struggle.
Right? You treat the adult that contains the child and the child is still there.
And so you're treating the adult as the adult, but even when he talks about the warmth of the room or the hue of the light, and with Winnicott, he seemed so intentional with the tone of his voice that this maternal affectionate realm allowed for the patient to feel safe enough to access that hate without acting on it necessarily. Like they can tap into something that they're lacking.
This is the part where Winnicott is going to out-mother their actual mother.
Yes.
Can I say, like, sometimes when we read these papers and the author talks about their dreams, I get a little annoyed because it's a first-person subjective thing and you're using it as evidence or you're using it as some kind of like as a tool for us, the reader, to try to take this more seriously. And I just want to point out, I'm maybe scolding myself a little bit. Did you hear how much I struggled to try to put this into words? How complicated this is? Suddenly I'm thankful for this dream because the dream does kind of put a metaphor sheen over this that I can latch onto. And at least I can hold the shape of this dynamic in my mind, through this dream. Does that make sense?
No, it makes absolute sense. And, we were talking about this before off mic and you were complaining.
Yeah.
I think I can use that word. You were complaining about analysts adducing dreams as evidence for some sort of universal phenomenon. And I will say, and again, I'm sorry that I just said I was going to start here, but maybe it's better that actually we got to, the mother and analyst pairing before going back into Winnicott's healing dreams. I don't think that that's what Winnicott is doing here. I think that he is saying, and it's really in the first person, he says, and this is a quote, recently for a period of a few days, I found I was doing bad work, close quote. I think he's like, this is in the first person. And he's like, I had these dreams, and he's not saying like, and then I discovered the nature of reality.
Right. Enneagrams came to me in a dream.
Every person has a shadow, right? Like there's no, it's not so, I'm sorry.
We're gonna lose
Jungians.
We're hemorrhaging Jungians here.
Sorry, friends.
All right.
So he's not finding you actually in a properly Freudian way. I think Winnicott is understanding the dream as about the dreamer. It's about him, and it is about him qua analyst struggling, as we have now been struggling these 3 episodes, with the difficulty of analyzing patients who are not in that neurotic category, who are having an effect on him that he is struggling not just to master, but to manage. And so these 2 dreams are clarifying in a number of ways. They're clarifying for Winnicott in giving him a sense of why he feels he has been working badly with these severely disturbed patients. They're clarifying for us, the reader, in differentiating between not only this distinction that we talked about last time, what he means by neurotic versus psychotic patients, but also in giving us like a kind of, and maybe Dan, this is why you decided to be grateful for these dreams after all, a visual representation of what it feels like to be in the sort of relation with the patient, the type of patient that is giving him so much trouble.
Yeah, that's
right.
fair. Yeah.
So I'm just going to read this. That's enough preface. On this particular occasion, I was aware of the meaning of the dream as I woke or even before I woke. The dream had 2 phases. In the first, I was in the gods in a theater and looking down on the people a long way below in the stalls. I felt severe anxiety, as if I might lose a limb. This was associated with the feeling I have had at the top of the Eiffel Tower, that if I put my hand over the edge, it would fall off onto the ground below. This would be ordinary castration anxiety. In the next phase of the dream, I was aware that the people in the stalls were watching a play, and I was now related to what was going on the stage through them. A new kind of anxiety now developed. What I knew was that I had no right side of my body at all. This was not a castration dream. It was a sense of not having that part of the body. And I'm going to go ahead and just continue to read Winnicott's immediate analysis of these dreams, and then we can talk about them. As I woke, I was aware of having understood at a very deep level what was my difficulty at that particular time. The first part of the dream represented the ordinary anxieties that might develop in respect of unconscious fantasies of my neurotic patients. I would be in danger of losing my hand or my fingers if these patients should become interested in them. With this kind of anxiety, I was familiar and it was comparatively tolerable. The second part of the dream, however, referred to my relation to the psychotic patient. This patient was requiring of me that I should have no relation to her body at all, not even an imaginative one. There was no body that she recognized as hers, and if she existed at all, she could only feel herself to be a mind. Any reference to her body produced paranoid anxieties because to claim that she had a body was to persecute her. What she needed of me was that I should have only a mind speaking to her mind. At the culmination of my difficulties on the evening before the dream, I had become irritated and had said that what she was needing of me was little better than hair splitting. This had had a disastrous effect, and it took many weeks for the analysis to recover from my lapse. The essential thing, however, was that I should understand my own anxiety, and this was represented in the dream by the absence of the right side of my body when I tried to get into relation to the play that the people in the stalls were watching. This right side of my body was the side related to this particular patient and was therefore affected by her need to deny absolutely even in an imaginative relationship of our bodies. This denial was producing in me this psychotic type of anxiety, much less tolerable than ordinary castration anxiety. Whatever other interpretations might be made in respect of this dream, the result of my having dreamed it and remembered it was that I was able to take up this analysis again and even to heal the harm done to it by my irritability, which had its origin in a reactive anxiety of a quality that was appropriate to my contact with a patient with no body.
It's a remarkable dream. And like, no, we don't know what the underlying traumas are or what the case history is here, right? We could presumably imagine a lot of things that could happen or could have happened to this woman that might put her in a position of, let's call it like this kind of like hypertrophied intellectualization, right? And a refusal to, as Winnicott puts it, if we're going to run with, charitably, let's read him charitably and presume this is what he's describing, right? That she doesn't have a body. She can't have a body in the same room as Winnicott, this other person who has a body, et cetera. We can imagine all sorts of horrible things, like as a child, as an adult, whatever, right? But clearly, when Winnicott, in some sort of moment of peak, was like, well, you're just splitting, this is all just intellectual sort of fine-grained distinctions without a difference. She did not hear that as trying to get her to like make some other point or make another synthetic point, et cetera. She heard that as, or seems to have heard that as, like an assault on her intellectualization or her having an intellect as such, which appears to be like the thing, the only, she's like, this is all I have, right? This is how I've survived. This is how I don't acknowledge these things, right? It occurs to me in this way that like, and this is maybe a simplistic analogy, right? But like we think about like how like some people supposedly can't take criticism because, think about this, like there's an axiom, like, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe they'll fire you. Maybe they'll hit themselves in the head, be like, stupid, whatever it is. Like people who can't take criticism, right? You think of this is like that, but existential, right? The thing that would appear to be criticism to them, or that we would call criticism, is like an assault on the self, right? And so Winnicott was upset, and also delivering an interpretation, if we want to call it that someone who had a more, like a sense like, okay, yeah, I'm an integrated mind and body. I make logical errors sometimes, but also sometimes, I sit in chairs and I'm comfortable. Who knows, right, what the landscape is. But that his remark there spun her out and struck at Winnicott's own perennial sort of anxieties about being able to heal people. And this manifested sort of communicatively in his dream, where he's like, no, this is what this person feels like. And you need to understand, like, you need to enter onto the ground floor of the
into
theater.
Their terrain, into their psychic terrain. I think that's exactly right. And I think we would do ourselves a disservice as readers if we don't linger with the weirdness. I don't mean that as like a criticism of the patient. And maybe listening, you can think about your own dreams and the ways in which, sometimes they can profoundly shake you up. But I'm not, I mean, I always find this interesting talking to Dan about things like this because, he's a visual artist and I'm not like a very visual person. Like you give me text and I'm happy. Right. But you cannot, I think, listen to or read this second part of Winnicott's dream and not picture it. It is all about orientation in space. And even the first part involves a certain amount of vertigo. There's a dizzying, vertiginous quality to it being up, but it's a kind of vertigo that we can handle, right? Think about, do you mind if I free associate from
Please.
a little bit? I like to go hiking. I like heights. Think about if you're a person that doesn't have a fear of heights, being up high can feel sort of powerful. It puts things in perspective, puts you in perspective, right? You don't have to just be like, I am the master of my domain. Like you can be small in addition to these other people below you. But this is above all about sort of orientation, reorientation, the spatialization of the self. And there is a way in which you can change that orientation in space in your life. And it might be stressful. Like driving from Philadelphia into Manhattan is always stressful for me, even though I've done it a million times. It's still a change of space. And I know that, there might be some anxiety involved in my trying to find some street parking, but I will survive that anxiety. It's a manageable anxiety. Might be touch and go for a minute or two there in the Lincoln Tunnel, but I will manage it, right? Okay, compare that to the feeling that you have when you're actually at the edge of a cliff. Whether it's because you feel that appel du vide, like, what if I jumped? Or whether it's because you have an actual attack of vertigo, that dizzying sense that I might fall and I might no longer exist anymore. It is the switch from that perspective, or that earlier perspective, the manageable anxiety of being in a different place, to the switch from that to the half of my body is gone. And again, I want you to picture this. Half of your body is gone. The right half of your body is gone.
It's not just that you're missing half your body. There's another switch that's happening here where the first half of the dream, for me, if I can free associate, whenever I see somebody hold a cell phone over a balcony or something like that, I'm actually just thinking about it, my palms are getting sweaty because they're going to drop their phone. That's my
I
castration
see you
anxiety.
actually clutching for
Yeah,
this
that's my castration
imaginary
anxiety.
other
They're going to
person.
drop their phone. But he goes, there's another layer to this that I think is really maybe the most interesting part to me. It's not just that he's missing half of his body. He also switches from being the observer to being observed.
Yes.
He's in front of an auditorium and he's uncomfortable because his body is lacking.
Yes. Yes. But it is like, this is not a manageable form of anxiety.
No, yeah.
This is
Properly horrifying.
I am going to fall off of this cliff and I will no longer exist. And in fact, half of me no longer exists. And for Winnicott, this flips a switch where he's like, oh my God, this patient cannot relate to herself as having a body at all. What must it be like? And it almost seems as though he is, I mean, I'm not like messing around with any sort of like woo-woo sort of like this is a vision that has been granted to Winnicott to understand. It's not that. It's not that. It's his unconscious symbolization of the impossibility of symbolization. Right? And I think the weirdness of this sense where he's like, he doesn't even say at the end, or he's like, my contact with a patient who feels herself to have no body. He says, my contact with a patient with no body. Okay, there is like a real way in which he has figured out that what he is dealing with is a person who has foreclosed the ability to have that bodily relation. And so it now makes so much more sense when he says, the couch is the analyst's lap or womb. The warmth is the warmth of the analyst's body. What he has to build up in this reparative work here is the physical landscape of a safe place. Okay. And it seems almost so rudimentary, right? But that is the level on which he has to work, because what he has to do before anything else is to restore this patient's body, right? And so again, we see Winnicott, this theorist of the good enough mother, becoming this most maternal of men as a doctor.
There's something like so classically psychoanalytic about the inclusion of a dream in a paper, right?
Yeah.
Like the writer's own dream, and
It works though.
yeah, and it's underwritten, and I guess this is like one of those things like read charitably, check your expectations at the door, right? But this is part and parcel of having like a commitment to a psychodynamic theory of mind, right? Like,
Yeah, listen to what yourself tells you when you're asleep.
yeah, your mind is still processing stuff. You're still metabolizing some stuff, and what D.W. Winnicott is metabolizing here, right, are difficult clinical encounters with people whom he finds difficult, but that also bring out something that he doesn't quite like in himself,
Yeah.
and that whose experience also, or like what it even means to talk about their experience, raises real questions for the clinical and like theoretical, like, and not like professional training that people like Winnicott have received, right? He's capable of himself, he says it, like managing neurotic castration anxiety,
Yeah.
but managing the like terror that is this woman's anxiety.
Yeah. That's that's a horse of a different color.
Right. And it's a heavy lift. And this brings us back to like, again, I think we're one of the points where we started, right? That there are tolls taken on clinicians just by virtue of doing the work, right? But also that they're like theories and like their interventions, like, so both like their models and justifications for things they actually do, right? Like their actions and ideas can be symptomatic of the distress that they feel, right? Or that they can feel distress when those theoretical models don't seem to be adequate to account for things they're, meeting, or when their clinical interventions don't quite seem to work. All the more reason why, here Winnicott himself says, like, he's willing to, it's understandable to him why people might send difficult patients, for treatments that he finds anathema, because at least he's willing to recognize the distress that such a difficult patient might elicit. And yet, he says, just because it's difficult, or rather precisely because it's difficult, is why you got to do it. And there is something almost existential in this kind of like can't go on and will go on kind of way, where you're like, just because this is impossible, or just because this is going to activate all these difficult things I've got doing, that's what this job is. Like the essence of doing this job properly is sitting with this person's distress, understanding it, and adapting my theory and practice to better help them. Not like having someone, sever their limbs. Well, whether sever their lobes, talk about a slip there.
Yeah.
So they become more tractable. But it's also like this kind of situation where, and I think this segues into the last third of the piece, right? Winnicott is kind of bravely confessing these problems, right? But just let's hold alongside that some awareness that what he's now about to say, in addition to already going here to this difficult stuff, right? To conjuring these experiences and being like, well, we've all had healing dreams, but here's my healing anxiety dream about a whole other type of person, about a person, in fact, who would otherwise be seen as unanalyzable. All of which is to say that, like, in this paper, Winnicott is kind of showcasing, isn't just like thematizing, but he's like performing this working through of recognizing difficult feelings and recognizing the difficulty of having theoretical commitments that need to change in a way that's not just personal, but also sort of implicates other people in his profession, right? He seems to be saying we have certain models of what distress is, of how development works, etc., that do not account for some people whom we encounter in the world and the feelings that they elicit in us. And either we take those feelings seriously or we disavow them and act out in a bad way. And because we have chosen to be caregivers, if we're going to be serious about this, we have to embrace that difficulty, right? And in that sense, the role of the caregiver is similar to certain other human endeavors, which, the fact that they're fraught and can involve both confronting our own vulnerabilities and the vulnerability of others is not a reason why we don't do them. Rather, it's part and parcel of actually why we do them.
And then there's this other bit here, and I won't rehearse everything we talked about last time in terms of objective hate. I will say that it's not just that we do it because we must and because that is what therapy or what analysis, what medicine, I mean, I think he's thinking in all of those registers, what those things demand, but also because specifically not only the management of the hate, such that you are withholding it from the patient is what's required. What's also required is that hate, right? And there's this line that is so interesting, and I'm just going to read it here, and then we're going to spin it out in the context of what is functionally a long aside, but is in another way is a kind of case study that's folded into this essay. But Winnicott says, I want to add that in certain stages of certain analyses, the analyst's hate is actually sought by the patient. And what is then needed is hate that is objective. If the patient seeks objective or justified hate, he must be able to reach it. Else he cannot feel he can reach objective love. Right. So it's not just a matter of having, as an analyst, such a handle on those feelings of hate. It's also the even more, I would suggest, difficult job of knowing when the patient needs to see or hear it as a precondition for not only the feeling of being loved, but I want to say conviction, but if there's a word for conviction that is felt, conviction is a term about belief, but I mean it's like felt deeply in the self, the conviction that one deserves that love, right? That one is fundamentally, as a creature, as a being, deserving of consistent, continuous love.
It's sort of like we can call back to the examples of like the kid who's constantly hitting in the stuff that we read about aggression, right? At a certain point, the parent who is like understands that the kid is just accidentally punching them, right? Or when they're, getting their diaper changed, or doesn't fully understand how much it hurts when they, run into them face first or whatever. At a certain point, the adult has to express, well, that hurt me. Like, you as a subject have agency and you did a thing which caused me pain.
You affected me.
Yeah. And I hate when you do that, right? You have provoked a feeling of distress and anger in me because you hurt me.
That is warranted.
That is warranted.
That is warranted by the thing that you did.
Yeah. And then the child is like, oh, wow, I exist. This other person exists, right? I cannot go around hitting everyone. Not because they'll hit me back.
And movement and hitting are sometimes the same and sometimes different.
Yeah, they're sometimes different, but also like, not just because sometimes they're going to hit back, but also because, it's not just I don't want to get hit myself. It's that I like loving and nice touch. And I want to be a person who loves. And love means you don't hit people, right? So on some level, like, I think we'd be flattening to call it about like boundary testing in some ways, though it does have some aspects of that. It's more just like being kind of real in the sense of like, it's because I care about you and I'm not just showing up for you to slap me and then leave, that when you slap me, I tell you that's really bad. And if you keep doing that, I'm not coming anymore. Right. There's something about like the child has to be able to understand the implications of its actions. And that is a developmental achievement relative to not having any coordination over its own actions, but also just thinking that its actions never have any consequences because no one else exists.
Well, we have complete chaos every night from half
So glad to hear it.
7, where we really don't know if we're coming or going. Things are supposed to happen at certain times, but they never do, because something else dreadful happens. Somebody spills their milk, or something dreadful, or even awful things like that. We've seen the cat gets on somebody's bed and they can't go to sleep because the cat is there or isn't there, and they come down about 6 times to see what I'm doing. And it's complete chaos that time of the evening.
I like that bit about the cat, which either is there or isn't there. It's not a matter of your doing things rightly or wrongly. What's wrong is just the way things are, which makes it look as if the other way around would be right, but of course it wouldn't be. Or perhaps you don't notice all the things that go well, but everything that goes wrong a little bit becomes an awful issue, resulting in screams and yells.
So can we talk about the boy that Winnicott, who's the patient of Winnicott's, that he takes home for 3 months? Because this occupies an entire page of this very short essay.
And people who are interested in exploring this, there's the Brett Carr paper that gets into it more. And we've talked a lot, behind the paywall about sort of Winnicott's complicated family and other arrangements. But suffice it to say that Winnicott, in a way that is not as weird in the 40s as it would be now, right? Because remember, Winnicott dealing with orphans and kids who have been displaced by the Blitz, and with quote unquote juvenile delinquents who are in and out of various sort of predatory and, carceral systems. But that he, has no children of his own, does on occasion take into like his care and the care of his wife at the time, several people. But here he gives the example of one particular kid, and suffice it to say, there's objective, like empirical records that this kid was deeply troubled. We're talking like setting small fires or like running, constantly getting arrested, right? Small petty theft, etc. It seemed like
Winnicott gives him money every time he leaves the house so that he'll be able to get a call from the police station.
Yeah. So here's the and he actually, this is the wonderful line that gets to this. It is perhaps relevant to cite the case of the child of the broken home, or the child without parents. Such a child spends his time unconsciously looking for his parents. It is notoriously inadequate to take such a child into one's home and to love him. What happens is that after a while, a child so adopted gains hope, and then he starts to test out the environment he has found and to seek proof of his guardian's ability to hate objectively. It seems that he can believe in being loved only after reaching being hated.
I mean, this is the kernel of this whole essay, is it not? It's the part that I find the most difficult, and yet I think that it is probably the part that is the most original and important, right? Love comes after hate. And I mean, that actually makes more sense to me from an adult perspective, and we will get there with the mother's feelings of hate, and our final list will be Winnicott's reasons for the mother to hate the child. But this idea that it's not only that like the mother needs to hate, the analyst needs to hate in these, when the child is acting out, when the patient is in such distress, right? It's not just that patient needs the hate. The child needs the hate. So this kid is objectively like a terror, right? And Winnicott takes him in for 3 months, and he writes about it in this incredibly pragmatic way. And as I am struggling, and I am struggling with this idea, the child needs to be the recipient of this objective hatred. Let me just read like a tiny snippet here about Winnicott and this boy. The important thing for the purpose of this paper is the way in which the evolution of the boy's personality engendered hate in me and what I did about it. Did I hit him? The answer is no, I never hit. But I should have had to have done so if I had not known all about my hate, and if I had not let him know about it too. At crises, I would take him by bodily strength and without anger or blame and put him outside the front door, whatever the weather or the time of day or night. There was a special bell he could ring, and he knew that if he rang it, he would be readmitted and no word said about the past. He used this bell as soon as he had recovered from his maniacal attack. The important thing is that each time, just as I put him outside the door, I told him something. I said that what had happened had made me hate him. This was easy because it was so true. I think these words were important from the point of view of his progress, but they were mainly important in enabling me to tolerate the situation without letting out, without losing my temper, and every now and again murdering him. So there is this bit, and I think we've already gotten this, like, okay, the expression of the hate allows Winnicott, qua analyst, qua surrogate parent, to tolerate it. The thing that is hard to understand, and I want you, Patrick, to help me understand it better, is that this boy also needs this hate. And to me, I get some part of it is that the expression of this is about that Winnicott can survive every single thing that the child throws at him, right? Some of this is about consistency. Winnicott is an object that cannot be destroyed. But why then does he not need to simply be an object of hate that can't be destroyed by hate? Why does he also have to provide hate to the child?
We should really emphasize, like Winnicott describes the 3 months that he spent with this child, he and his wife spent with this child, as 3 months of hell.
Yeah.
Right. And the child was apparently, alternating between being disassociative and quote unquote running away, which just meant that they would be picked up at, they'd be found at the local police station and then come back. Right. And eventually, as Winnicott narrates the course of the child's stay with them, the child ceases running away, but now starts like physically attacking Winnicott and his wife.
Yeah.
And that's when he gets put outside.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like he's scruffing a kitten.
Yeah. It's also like, I think there are I'm thinking of a lot of different things at once here, and it's hard to talk about, and I'm not trying to be prescriptive about how people parent, right?
Yeah. That's not our ministry.
No, not at all. But I am thinking about sometimes, I knew kids growing up who, in terms of their material environment, wanted for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that in the sense literally that there was nothing that they could want that they wouldn't get, but there was something so ravenous about their sort of like appetite, or rather the way in which everything was available to them, meant that what they actively wanted was something that wouldn't be available to them, or some sort of check on it. Right. And again, it's hard to talk about it analogically, but like, I'm literally thinking here about like, kids who were in that like Gossip Girl, like fictionalized lifestyle, right? I'm literally talking about people like who would, there'd be like a punch bowl full of $20 bills just like sitting on the counter, and, mom might be in Milan and dad might be working in Wall Street or whatever, but you could just reach in there, grab a fistful of cash, and just, that was fine. Just check in with a babysitter at some point. Right. And, unsurprisingly, and actually at a very early age, that money starts going to like coke and pills, right? Kids can get into some really wild shit very young with those type of resources, right? And again, the analogy isn't perfect here, right? But it's like, I love you so much. I don't want you to have any friction. I want you to have everything that you could possibly want. I don't ever want you to feel distress. The idea of your crying is so terrible. Here's a stack of C notes. I know your friend is grounded, but how about you go pick her up anyways and do whatever you want, and here's a new phone, right? I don't think it was a coincidence that a lot of those kids somehow paradoxically like, my parents don't care if I live or die, right? Or that they would start chasing experiences that would be like, no, at least now my permissive parents are going to be, they're going to have to do something. And I'm not going full Christopher Lash here, but rather I'm saying that like,
thank goodness.
Yeah. But what I'm trying to, I'm trying to metaphorically move that back to an earlier level.
No,
right?
I get it.
The child needs to know that it matters enough that people can get angry at it for things that it does.
Yeah.
But still love it because it exists.
Right. I think that's the part that is that's important here, is like, not only does there need to be this adult figure that can survive the child's wrath, but the child has to understand, and this is why hate is important, because otherwise we could just kind of water this down and be like, kids need boundaries, kids thrive on schedules, kids need rules, all of which is true. I'm not like gainsaying any of that stuff. But part of why I'm pressing so hard, I'm like pressing in this like a bruise, like, why does it have to be hate? Why can't it just be limits? And because, again, what we're talking about, what's at stake here is the construction of a self that can survive these sorts of onslaughts, and also that can survive the construction of limits and rage, because I think there's something about the idea that like this sense of continuity, that I as a self will persist. It requires you to emerge from a sort of crucible of having it, you know you can do it because you already did it. You know you can survive it because you already survived it. But crucially, that hate has to come from someone who is also providing unconditional love.
Yes, but also I think this ties the bow on it, right? It's not just about the adults surviving the child's onslaughts or at some point being like, this is too far and now I'm angry at you, right? It's because the adults, in the way that they do this, model and communicate that they are also struggling with the problem of aggression. Not just the child's problem of aggression, which they're helping it manage.
The problem of aggression.
The problem of aggression qua what they're experiencing as anger towards the child, right? And so they will do something like put you in the timeout. I'm really upset right now. I'm not going to talk to you until you apologize to me, right? What I'm trying to kind of make the point here is that the child doesn't just exist in fear or vulnerability of or to the aggression of the adult, right? Which is something that the adult needs to support it and not take advantage of, right, et cetera. The child is also in fear of being overwhelmed by its own aggression. It's scared that its own aggression can make people stop loving it. And when an adult, instead of mirroring the child back, right, or affirming the child's fears of like, no, actually, you're going to come to pieces if you have these feelings, right? Or the adult coming to pieces when they have those feelings and beating the child, right? You instead have an adult being like, I'm working on similar, I've got these feelings too. I've got the adult version of these feelings, but because I'm an adult, here's how I'm going to deal with it. And also, here's how I'm going to help you get towards that by doing this thing to you now, which is something that you're going to hate my doing, right? And that is coming from some degree of, anger from me. So in other words, again, this is the quintessentially psychodynamic aspect of this. Everyone is dealing with aggression in different developmental modes, but also in relation to one another across their respective developmental positions.
Yep.
And so it's the ability for the child to be like, okay, I'm capable of experiencing a feeling hate towards people, but that doesn't destroy them. Also, people can get angry and hateful towards me, but they may still love me. That finds kind of its mirroring in, well, Winnicott's already said this, with the clinician who's like, I can hate this patient, but I still want to care for them. But also, Winnicott seems to suggest that's kind of mirrored or like organically connected to the way in which a parent has to relate to its own child.
This all smacks of reality testing to me. Am I far off?
It is. Reality testing, I think, is a helpful metaphor for it. Another one might be like, we're talking about like the dialectical recognition of subjectivity.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I honestly, like, I wasn't going to do this. I'm sorry. I did
bust out the Hegel. Let's do it.
This morning, as one does of a Tuesday morning, I padded down the hallway to find my trusty copy of the Phenomenology of Spirit because I was like, what do I need to help me understand this? It was Hegel. This is, for those of you familiar with the Phenomenology of Spirit, in the section that immediately precedes Lordship and Bondage, which is often known as the master-slave dialectic section of the book, which is really about the birth of subjectivity in and through the relation to the other, which involves a mutual attempt to destroy the other. But before what is the sort of proto-subject gets there, we're at this stage that Hegel calls self-consciousness. And so this is a quotation here. Self-consciousness is thus certain of itself only by superseding this other that presents itself to self-consciousness as an independent life. Self-consciousness is desire. Certain of the nothingness of this other, it explicitly affirms that this nothingness is for it the truth of the other. It destroys the independent object and thereby gives itself the certainty of itself as a true certainty, a certainty which has become explicit for self-consciousness itself in an objective manner. Now, what's happening here is self-consciousness continues to destroy the object. And you can think about object. I actually think it's totally fine because this is a podcast that's about psychoanalysis and not about Hegel, but also because I think this is a totally fine reading of this book, to think about the object in a psychoanalytic sense. An object can be a person, but it can also be a literal object. And at this stage of development, what self-consciousness is looking for is, first of all, certainty of its own self as having what for Hegel is called self-standingness. Like it continues to exist. And so here, though, it keeps destroying the object. And so it proves that it exists, but there's something that's fundamentally unsatisfying about existing in this kind of solipsistic way where there is nothing else that exists besides you. And so you go looking, or self-consciousness goes looking for an other that it cannot destroy. And that's the part. So like, I'm sorry if you hated that little aside, but hopefully it was helpful. Like this, I think, is part of like the kernel of what's at stake here, is that part of being a integrated, or let's go with intact self, not that you don't experience fragmentation, that you don't experience change, but you can withstand all of that stuff, is being able to find an object that you can't destroy. So that could be the mother, that could be the analyst, but also realizing that you yourself cannot be destroyed. And so you need to be the object of aggression and hate in order to discover that capacity to survive as intact self. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about in the fourth installment are things like hate crimes. I'm not talking about the idea that you have to survive a malicious form of hate in order to be an intact subject. I'm not suggesting that at all. Let me be really, really clear. But I think there's something here. And again, it's such an interesting counterpoint to Winnicott as this gentle soul, but maybe that's why he could, in some ways, find this capacity for hate and become the theorist that says, like, sometimes analysts have to hate and acknowledge that hate. And also, and this is where we're going in the final section here, mothers have to. Mothers have to. And not just in the way that sometimes analysts working with exceptionally distressed people have to be able to access this and not enact it, but acknowledge it. All mothers or primary caretakers have to be able to access this hate.
And it's here that I think thinking about Winnicott as like an environmental thinker, or as a thinker of, well, you know, the child, the family, and the outside world, really, I think, helps in conjunction with the Hegel, or at least in sort of helping us ground the Hegel, insofar as that it's not about just like some abstract, like self-consciousness seeking recognition from some other self-consciousness, right? We're dealing with an organic being that literally spends an extended period of time as essentially part of or surrounded by another being's body, emerges into the world.
It is part of that body. It's not just
Yeah, it exists.
It is entirely dependent.
Yeah, it exists in this matrix where it's like the mother is breathing for it and doing basic like nutrition for it, etc. And suddenly it is plunged into the world. And we don't necessarily have to think of birth as a trauma, right? But we can ask the question of like, well, what does it mean for that little creature that came from another creature to achieve self-consciousness, right? It's not an abstract question. It's actually literally one of getting a sense of its own sort of bodily integrity as that body develops, but also while it's still in this relationship of, it's suckling, it's nursing, it's getting the bottle, whatever it is, of like abject vulnerability and physical dependence on other bodies.
Yeah.
And it thus wouldn't be unfair to say, and this is something I think that we should flag, that Winnicott is sympathetic to or is capable of imagining in a way that Freud is not, right? Namely, that child is, even under the best of circumstances, even with the most loving possible mother, exists in a position of, well, subjugation to the mother, you could say, right? Or rather, the mother needs, right? And it's, and her, or their, like, presence literally looms over the child, right? It is in other words, what I'm trying to get at here, and this is something that is worth noting, like Freud is a theorist of, he's quick, he will blame mothers for not being there, right? Absent mothers are things he imagines. Mothers who are made to be absent by fathers, he's also more than willing to imagine. This is that sort of the whole Oedipal complex, right? But the idea of a mother who is present to the point of it being oppressive or having some sort of pathogenic, or at least being a burden, is something that Freud, for reasons probably having to do with his own personal biography, is unwilling to think about.
Well, he's not attuned to it.
Yeah. We're not even necessarily talking about like the smothering mother, right? Or the mother that tries to keep nursing their child until they're 18 or something, right? What we're talking about is literally just the fact that this emergent self-consciousness is a product of this other consciousness, of this other embodied conscious, rather. There's like an extrusion of it. And in order to differentiate, at some point, that means that it's going to have to be like, okay, this is too much, right? This environment, I am different from this environment. Like much of the same way as a child literally emerged from the environment of the mother.
I'm sorry,
right,
I'm
physically.
thinking about the pasta attachment on our
Yes.
KitchenAid.
But much as a child initially like emerged from that kind of like Pappardelle extrusion machine or whatever, right? Like physically, the child also has to psychically emerge from its sort of overwhelming dependence upon the figure of the caregiver. And that's why the aggression, that in order to have that pushing away, that differentiation, that's what's troped here as aggression.
Right. Absolutely. I agree. That distance without destruction of either.
If that's a task for the child and the like aggression towards the caregiver is a difficult thing, well, Winnicott also, unlike Freud, wants to turn to something that is the corollary of that, namely what a difficult task it is for the mother too.
Do you find that there are things for yourself you would like to be doing, like writing a novel or baking a special cake or anything peculiar to yourself that the children prevent you from doing?
Oh, yes, I think I'd like to have a lot more outside interest than I am able to have at the time.
What sort of things would you like to do outside?
Well, I am very interested in all sorts of social work and all those kind of things I would like to do, things I have been told I could do or been offered to take part in, which I have not been able to do because I haven't had the time. And I have found it very frustrating not to be able to do any of these things because I have to be at home.
I did a sewing class last year, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But when the second child came along, I just found I couldn't get ready in time. And then by about 8 o'clock, I thought, oh dear, I really can't be bothered to go out to it. But are there things that you like to be doing?
Yes, I'm very fond of sewing, and that's a very irritating job when children. And I really like that, and I get frightfully immersed in it and let time slip by rather, and that leads to trouble. And I'm not a good timekeeper either. You know, I like to forget about it. very much. I'm quite
You like that anyway, regardless of
Yes,
the
I
food.
am. Quite, yes, quite
I find one very irritating thing is to have to stop whatever I'm doing in the morning and prepare a meal, a midday meal.
Yes.
Which I would get by with on something like a boiled egg, but
Yes,
one
I have a
can't.
husband then as well, so I have a, we
yes,
have
you
a
work-
bumper meal
Yes,
in the
you
middle
do
of the
quite
day.
well.
Here, a husband's coming in along with the children, expecting things and completely destroying any effort the wife, mother, may be making to preserve a personal interest of her own, one that demands concentration.
This is the final section, and I think we have been, we've been alluding throughout to the way that the analyst and the mother are parallel here. But if you actually read this paper, the mother really shows up, except at that pivot point I was talking about before, but like as an actual figure, as a developed figure, not just as a sort of way for the analyst to think about himself, but in her own right, in the very end of this piece. And so I am going to, if you'll all bear with me, read a long passage because I think that it is really important for us to hear this in Winnicott's own words. And also because it's fabulous, okay? It is fabulous, this long litany of ways that the mother hates the child. So here it is, the final section on mother's love and hate. And I'll preserve the segue so you can see just the way that Winnicott's doing it. Out of all the complexity of the problem of hate and its roots, I want to rescue one thing because I believe it has an importance for the analyst of psychotic patients. I suggest that the mother hates the baby before the baby hates the mother and before the baby can know his mother hates him. Before developing this theme, I want to refer to Freud's remarks. In Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, 1915, where he says so much that is original and illuminating about hate, Freud says, we might at a pinch say of an instinct that it loves the objects after which it strives for purposes of satisfaction. But to say that it hates an object strikes us as odd. So we become aware that the attitudes of love and hate cannot be said to characterize the relation of instincts to their objects, but are reserved for the relations of the ego as a whole to objects. Now, close quote of Winnicott quoting Freud, still quoting Winnicott. This, I feel, is true and important. Does this not mean that the personality must be integrated before an infant can be said to hate? However early integration may be achieved, perhaps integration occurs earliest at the height of excitement or rage. There is a theoretical earlier stage in which whatever the infant does that hurts is not done in hate. I have used the word ruthless love in describing this stage. Is this acceptable? As the infant becomes able to feel a whole person, so does the word hate develop meaning as a description of a certain group of his feelings. Okay, and now we get to the heart of the matter. The mother, however, hates her infant from the word go. I believe Freud thought it possible that a mother may, under certain circumstances, have only love for her boy baby, but we may doubt this. We know about a mother's love, and we appreciate its reality and power. Let me give some of the reasons why a mother hates her baby, even a boy.
Take that, Freud.
A, the baby is not her own mental conception. B, the baby is not the one of childhood play, father's child, brother's child, etc. C, the baby is not magically produced. D, the baby is a danger to her body in pregnancy and at birth. E, the baby is an interference with her private life, a challenge to preoccupation. F, to a greater or lesser extent, a mother feels that her own mother demands a baby, so that her baby is produced to placate her mother. G, the baby hurts her nipples, even by suckling, which is at first a chewing activity. H, he is ruthless, treats her as scum, an unpaid servant, a slave. She has to love him, excretions and all, at any rate at the beginning, till he has doubts about himself. Patrick, stop, stop laughing. J, he tries to hurt her, periodically bites her, all in love. K, he shows disillusionment about her. L, his excited love is cupboard love, so that having got what he wants, he throws her away like orange peel. M, the baby at first must dominate. He must be protected from coincidences. Life must unfold at the baby's rate, and all this needs his mother's continuous and detailed study. For instance, she must not be anxious when holding him, etc. N, at first he does not know at all what she does or what she sacrifices for him. Especially he cannot allow for her hate. O, he is suspicious, refuses her good food, and makes her doubt herself, but eats well with his aunt. P, after an awful morning with him, she goes out and he smiles at a stranger who says, "Isn't he sweet?" Q, if she fails him at the start, she knows he will pay her out forever. R, he excites her but frustrates. She mustn't eat him or trade in sex with him. All right, and I'm just going to read one last little bit that, after this almost entire alphabet note of reasons for hatred. Winnicott says, I think that in the analysis of psychotics and in the ultimate stages of the analysis, even of a normal person, the analyst must find himself in a position comparable to that of the mother of a newborn baby. When deeply regressed, the patient cannot identify with the analyst or appreciate his point of view any more than the fetus or newly born infant can sympathize with the mother. A mother has to be able to tolerate hating her baby without doing anything about it. She cannot express it to him. I'm going to skip for a few lines. The most remarkable thing about a mother is her ability to be hurt so much by her baby and to hate so much without paying the child out, and her ability to wait for rewards that may or may not come at a later date. Close quote. There is more, but I will simply say that one of the things that you absolutely can't miss is that there might be certain forms of song or utterance, like, for instance, Rockabye Baby, where, I don't know if you know this, but the baby actually dies. In Rockabye Baby, it's where a lullaby can be being crooned and sung, and so you can be taking care of this child while also wishing him harm and death while still rocking. The mother, I am done quoting and I'm done doing all of my little weird impressions. The mother hates the infant from the word go.
I mean, it's remarkable, right? Because it's part of it is being cheeky, right? Clearly he's playing it up. I mean, and obviously these don't apply in all cases, right? Not everyone takes their baby on a walk and has this encounter.
Honestly,
they're iconic.
I think
right?
that is kind of pretty. I don't even believe in universals, and that's pretty universal,
right? But you take what I'm saying. He's not necessarily saying that these are experiences that are necessarily equivalently and equally consciously inevitable among all mothers.
No. It's a whole suite of reasons for that one might have to hate.
Right. And specifically a whole suite of reasons that one might, as a mother, find oneself with one's previous, let's call them theoretical or ideological or narrative expectations about what this emotional relationship that they're embarking on should look like, will suddenly find themselves that not squaring with their experience. Right. And specifically not squaring with the ways in which their own experience is oftentimes one of frustration. Right.
And of having to put the needs of the self aside.
Exactly. In other words, in a way that's very analogous to the position of like the psychotherapist who is like believes that they should only ever feel good things about their patient, right? Or the caregiver who sort of like feels that by feeling badly about someone whom they're giving care, they're actually hurting them. The problem of the mother's recognition of her own dissatisfaction, of her own aggression, of her own hatred, is part of the process of her loving better.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's integral.
It's integral. And if she doesn't do it, Winnicott has this line that actually sometimes some mothers, particularly it seems to be in a Western culture with certain ideas of femininity, will take that hate out on herself.
Yes.
And Winnicott even has a line here, like so many theories by other psychoanalysts about how women are basically masochistic, simply reflect like the cult of the mother and the way in which experiences that women have are like rendered either taboo and they can't talk about them amongst themselves, or they're unthinkable for supposed experts like Winnicott to share, such that they this is just me. I'm the only one.
In which connection, this is almost like a consciousness raising document.
Yeah. It has that element, right? And it also like, you know, in our next session, we'll put this to work both like to talk specifically about how, I don't know, among other things, we could probably detect some of these displacements of anger in like our culture's robust interest in like stories of women who snap and kill their children, like an entire genre of true crime that people like.
I was thinking Medea.
Yeah. I mean, hell, from Medea to Serial, I guess, right? Like the point is what Winnicott seems to be saying essentially, right, is that parents, no matter how much we might like to idolize them or establish taboos.
Or idealize them.
Yeah. Idealize them, are human beings too, which means that they're working through the problem of aggression. Moreover, they're working through specific problems of managing their own aggression as they function as, you know, as they're in the impossible but necessary business of being good enough to survive their own child's developmental expressions of aggression. And also all the other ways that society like chafes and makes their experience miserable.
And as they are, like, don't forget that part of being the good enough mother involves, even though Winnicott is, I think, you know, extraordinarily kind and understanding to mothers in a way that is really unusual in a male analyst and doctor, the position of good enough is still extraordinarily demanding because it requires an attunement to another that often means you can no longer be as attuned to yourself, right? And I think that is part of what is so lovely to see in this list, in how naked it is, in this idea that just in caring for this other being, instead of sort of valorizing this like kenosis, right? This sort of self-emptying, or this idea that like the mother ought to sacrifice everything, including herself and including everything that mattered to her prior to becoming a mother. But I think there is this sense that even being the good enough mother is going to require, at least for a substantial amount of time when the child is in this state of extraordinary dependence and vulnerability, you still have to put that being first, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean being the giving tree, but it definitely means no longer tending to yourself in the same way, including your own interests, maybe your career, certainly your hobbies, right? There is this way in which there is a setting aside of the self. And Winnicott, I think, is really clear that is a sacrifice, and it's not one that we need to, not that it doesn't have its own rewards, but they are uncertain and may come decades later.
So another way of sort of saying this is that like there's like a profound asymmetry in terms of like, or there can be or what we're dealing with is a kind of like asymmetry of expectations or the capacity to identify, right? Like Winnicott earlier said, like one thing that a patient can't do is attribute to the analyst mental states and relationships that they themselves have not been able to develop, right?
That they haven't experienced.
Yeah. Or that they haven't developed a capacity to experience,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
And Winnicott here is sort of saying one thing that is like, it would be a real category error to perpetrate would be to expect a child to understand what the mother is going through.
Exactly. That's crucial.
And if either in our parenting, as we, you know, how we treat the child, or in like our narratives about what parenting should be, if we are parents, or in our like ideological, broader, like social, you know, like romances or cults of what parenting must or has to be, we hold children to standards, you know, that are inappropriate for the developmental level, or hold ourselves to standards that are kind of like cruel in terms of how they disavow our own sort of
They're self-punitive.
aggression. Yeah. Then it's not just a category error anymore. It's actually a type of a failure of care. And that's kind of brings us to one of the questions that I said we could almost gloss like this whole essay as asking when we opened it, right? Namely, like, what is the point of our ideas of aggression, right? Like, who do they serve, right? Or like, what's the point or the utility, or for whom does our idea of something like hate exist, right? If our idea of hate is something that becomes, in this Victorian way, and Winnicott even says like the sentimental child or the sentimental house is not a place to raise a child.
Sentimental mother. His sentimentality is useless for parents as it contains a denial of hate, and sentimentality in a mother is no good at all from the infant's point of view.
It seems to me doubtful whether a human child, as he develops, is capable of tolerating the full extent of his own hate in a sentimental environment. Right. And you can imagine
and then don't forget the next line. He needs hate to hate. So in fact, all of these what was it, A through R or whatever, like, in fact, you're doing your child a favor.
Yeah.
Not necessarily by communicating this to them, but by feeling the feeling.
And, you communicate it in a displaced way through the nursery rhyme.
Right.
Right.
Down will come baby, cradle and all.
And then Winnicott ties it all together by being like, look, only in this way, i.e. by recognizing all these sort of mirrorings, but also asymmetries, can there be any hope of the avoidance of therapy that is adapted to the needs of the therapist rather than to the needs of the patient, right? So in other words, what he seems to be saying here, and again, this is the opposite of a mother blaming piece, right? This is good enough mothering is almost impossible, but what's amazing is that so many people do it. Good enough, like, psychotherapy is impossible, and yet it's necessary, and it's amazing so many people do it, right? Winnicott even has this idea like he calls like the non-impinging analyst is sort of like the analogy to the good enough mother. But what he seems to be suggesting sort of above all is that like the problem of aggression and the question of hate is something that everybody has to deal with. And the moment you've arrived at the position where you're like, oh no, this person doesn't have it and I don't have it, etc., right? Well, Winnicott seems to be suggesting, and he's not judging mothers here. What he does seem to be judging, and people who do seem to be blaming, are therapists.
Yes.
Right? Because it's their failure to recognize hate developmentally, doesn't treat means they don't treat their patients well, means presumably they don't treat the mothers under their care well, etc. But that finds expression in they're doing something that actually is contemptible, right? Namely harming their patients. This essay offers something that's so incredibly like iconoclastic, right? And so it goes against all these sort of taboos, but I feel like there's also something really humane about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I want to wind up for today with some of the last lines before the summary, which I think is going to set us up nicely for the fourth and final installment. And this concerns the communication of the hate to the patient or to the child. Winnicott says, if all this is accepted, there remains for discussion the question of the interpretation of the analyst's hate to the patient. This is obviously a matter fraught with danger, and it needs the most careful timing. But I believe an analysis is incomplete if even towards the end it has not been possible for the analyst to tell the patient what he, the analyst, did unbeknown for the patient whilst he was ill in the early stages. Until the interpretation is made, the patient is kept to some extent in the position of infant, one who cannot understand what he owes to his mother. Close quote.
It's unclear how seriously we should take Winnicott in terms of his like programmatic suggestion that every analysis ends, or is it an analysis is incomplete or imperfect if the analyst doesn't say, well, this is why I hated you, or what this is when I hated you, right?
Yes.
And he sees elsewhere in the paper, some people may not be able to ever survive that wound, right? Or that might undo the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think motivated our choice of this essay and of this topic of hate and aggression, and where we'll go in our next episode, right, is setting aside how explicit feelings of hatred should be in the analytic encounter. We might ask ourselves, perhaps some expression of negativity or hatred might be appropriate in other types of relationships or encounters, i.e., maybe, I don't know, in a nominal democratic discourse. Perhaps communicating that one finds someone else contemptible may have an objective grounding, or it may not have an objective grounding. But it may not be as entirely out of bounds as what might happen between a mother and child, right? And then we might also ask, what are the malformations or deformations of refusing to think about hate in relation to our idealized notions of civic virtue, of dispassionate technocracy, or of even like things like cruelty, which we can choose to either acknowledge, disavow, work through,
or enact.
All these examples illustrate in how many ways the care of small children can be irksome, and this is true however much the children are loved and wanted. The problem is one for the mother whose privacy is being invaded. Surely somewhere there is a little bit of herself that is sacrosanct, that can't be got at even by her own child. Shall she defend herself or surrender? The awful thing is that if the mother has something hidden away somewhere, that is exactly what the small child wants. If there is no more than a secret, then it is the secret that must be found and turned inside out. Her handbag knows all about this.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely supported and made possible by our Patreon community. If you want 2 additional episodes per month behind the paywall, including the 2nd and upcoming 4th installment of this series, come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Dan Yowell. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.
got your nose.